The purpose of this presentation is to give the real objective truth about how the EU works in practice, as there have been many myths and lies about the subject, by presenting a simple and clear overview of the fundamental levers of its workings. It is split in two parts, firstly giving an overview of the EU institutions, and then looking briefly in more depth into the major ones. It is striking to note that no clear explanation of how the EU works is given by the press, media and the politicians. A major communications deficit which has opened a boulevard for extremists to lie and distort its workings to support their views. For instance, saying that Brussels, namely the European Commission, decides everything, all our laws. I would like to explain the fundamental workings of the European Union with this slide, which I compare to a cycle wheel with 3 circles. In the first outer circle of the tower are the flags of the 28, now 27, member states, which keep control over an average 70% of their own affairs, independently of what happens at the European level, under the principle called subsidiarity. The second circle, the European Council, brings together the government heads of the member states, similar to a presidential system, that look after their sovereignty. It's the institution that has the most political authority. It's these presidents who set the strategy, the main guidelines and the priorities of the EU, and decide on the treaties to be established. It's the mode of working called intergovernmental. It's these presidents in the European Council who have the main role in appointing the European government, namely the European Commission and its commissionaires in the third circle. The commissioners, however, once appointed by each member state, must remain independent of their original country and look after the general interest of the whole of the EU. The Commission has an administration which, like other governments, is not elected. It's the mode of working called community. So to summarize, we have the first circle with member states looking after their own affairs, namely subsidiarity. The second circle with its presidents looking after their sovereignty, namely the intergovernmental. And the third circle, the European Commission, looking after the general interests of the whole of the EU, namely the community approach. The European Parliament, bottom right, comprises directly elected citizens of Parliament from each member state and represents the European citizens. The Council of Ministers, bottom left, called the Council, comprises government ministers from each member state and is similar to a Senate, but with much more powers, because it's formed from the remainder of the government of each member state. Thus, the head of government is positioned at the European Council in the second circle, and his or her ministers in the Council of Ministers. This body looks after the interests of the member states. I've added the other major institutions, top right, namely the European Central Bank, managing the Eurozone, the European Court of Justice based in Luxembourg, which oversees the respect of the treaties and norms, which should not be confused with the European Court of Human Rights based in Strasbourg, which is independent of the EU, and the Court of Auditors. The first thing that can strike one looking at this organisational structure is the obvious tension between the heads of government of member states looking after their sovereignty in the second circle, the intergovernmental, and the Commission with its community vision of looking after the general interest of the whole of the EU. To help us understand this organisational structure, we need to understand that it's originated from a supranational model conceived by France in 1950 for the European Coal and Steel Community, and this model was used at the beginning of the European project in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. There were 6 instead of 28 countries in the first outer circle. A high authority in the centre, just like the European Commission today, looking after the general interest with its supranational community approach. There was a parliamentary assembly, like the European Parliament today, but purely consultative, a council like the current Council of Ministers. But a major point, there was no Council of Heads of Government. It's the creation of the second circle of the European Council of Heads of Government in 1974, and citizens directly electing their European Parliament in 1979, which fundamentally changed the functioning of the EU and explains the current organisation here. Let's have an overview to understand how laws are decided. We've already mentioned that it's the heads of government of member states, the presidents, in the second circle, who set the direction, the priorities, the impetus for the EU. Then the European Commission prepares and submits proposals, and I stress the word proposals and not decisions, because decisions are made by the governments of member states within the Council of Ministers, together with the European Parliament, for almost all laws, that is, the legislative process, as per a normal democracy. But the Council of Ministers retains certain sovereign areas for itself, independently from the European Parliament. For instance, direct taxation and the management of the euro within the Eurogroup. Thus, the management of the Greek crisis was not co-decided with the European Parliament. You often hear in the press and media that it's Brussels, meaning the European Commission, which imposes the laws. But as we've seen, the Commission can only propose but not decide upon laws. In theory, the European Commission has the monopoly of initiating legislative proposals. What is the source of these proposals? Whilst investigating the question, I learned that 85 to 95% of proposals originated outside the European Commission, which I have summarised here. First of all, there are the main political guidelines, the impetus, the priorities set by the heads of government of member states within the European Council. And from my latest research into this area, interviewing real connoisseurs on the subject, the European Council is involved far more in detailed conclusions as to what they want. The European Parliament, although not having the formal power of initiating legislative proposals, has nonetheless the power to submit special initiative rights for that purpose, and doesn't hesitate to do so. The governments of member states collected within the Council of Ministers and their full-time representatives in Brussels work closely with the Commission on their proposals. Both the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers can submit proposals to the European Commission, which the latter is obliged to answer. There are decentralised agencies, for instance the European Aviation Safety Agency, the European Medicine Agency. There are lobbies of industrial sectors, NGOs of all sorts, in all some 30,000 persons, public opinion, and also the treaties that need to be respected. Here is the flow of a proposal that has been discussed at many levels with many people and institutions, including national governments, before arriving at the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament for decision. Even here, if a third of the countries consider that a proposal does not lie within the competence of the EU, they can submit a yellow card to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which will decide on the issue. The laws decided by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament are essentially of two sorts, namely directives and regulations. A directive gives the objective to be attained by the member states with a deadline, but leaves them the choice of how to adapt them to their national procedures. But in practice, member states add their own layers, sometimes many layers, called gold plating, which can at the end vary rather differently from the initial objective. A French example, where it was scoffed that a directive forbade 16-year-old apprentices from climbing ladders with more than 3 rungs. The original directive in 1994 simply encouraged member states to look after the protection of younger workers. The remainder was due to the French state, and they're not the only member state doing this. A regulation, on the other hand, is applied in all countries directly, which the European Commission implements, but under the control of member states. Let's look at a slide giving an overview as to what in reality the EU deals with. Starting bottom right, here are the various member states with their political powers in numerous areas. It's the member states which decide which powers, which building stones they wish to use to build the European edifice, the main one being its bedrock, its values. The pillars of the Parthenon represent the main areas that the EU deals with. The first pillar representing the single market with its norms and rules to stop, for instance, internal protectionism, which gives a framework within which member states are responsible for making a success or not of their affairs, and where the European Commission works in particular on agriculture and fishing matters. The second column is for the Eurozone, which offers a framework similar to the single market. The third pillar represents cohesion funds that are redistributed to poorer countries and areas to help reduce differences in wealth. The fourth pillar, the EU in the world, with its embryo of a foreign affairs ministry and international aid. And the last column, various, for instance, parts of defence, penal policy, migrations. The small blue circle top right shows the European Commission, which manages and administers the edifice, and to whom the member states gave the thankless task of preparing its norms and regulations. A point that I like to stress is that member states remain in full control of their decisions, especially their receipts and public expenditure, so they only share a part of their powers. For instance, a minimum of social rights, such as the 48-hour week. Member states within the Eurozone also remain in control of their decisions on the economy, their taxes, their public expenditure, retirement rules, etc., but again within the limits of the rules for the Eurozone. Member states can choose to progress further and share more of their sovereign powers, such as defence, direct taxation, social policy, health policy, penal policy, but need to decide unanimously to do so. So one can see in this picture that member states decide by treaty which powers they wish to be handled at the European Union level, and they remain mostly limited to a few key areas. Let's look in further detail into these powers called competencies, which are decided at the EU level. This subject is covered by the Treaty of Lisbon, which sets the rules, which is the Bible of its functioning. Please note that Article 5 of the Lisbon Treaty states that the Union shall act only within the limits of the competencies conferred upon it by the member states in the treaties. Otherwise, competencies remain within member states, so the idea that the EU can decide on everything is completely false. There are 3 categories of competencies. An exclusive competence, when member states have decided to transfer the whole of their powers, their competencies in an area, such that member states can no longer legislate in their home countries, but everything must be decided at the EU level. There are few exclusive competencies, for instance, the common commercial policy, competition, or the management of the euro. A shared competence. Here member states have only transferred a part of their competence, such that they can continue to legislate alongside the EU. It's the most common case. The EU then acts in place of a member state when a joint action is considered more effective than member states acting separately. For example, transport. A supporting competence. When the main competence remains with the member states, that is, the EU supports, coordinates, or supplements the actions of member states, such as research, but it's entirely the decision of the member state to participate or not. To summarize, the EU only acts in those areas agreed upon by member states. This slide gives an overview about how the laws come about in practice, where due to the large number of countries and the complexity of subjects, many directives and regulations result from detailed discussions between groups of experts from each of the major institutions, principally the European Commission, the Council of Ministers, and the European Parliament, called Trilogy, to facilitate the adoption of laws. Nonetheless, there are rules regarding transparency that need to be respected. To summarize, we have an EU organisational model which works more or less well, but which is effectively a model of a hybrid democratic government, where the heads of government in the European Council choose their commissioners, similar to a presidential system appointing its governmental ministers. But thereafter, these commissioners act independently in the interest of the whole of the EU. Thus, the European Parliament doesn't have its government in power, but nonetheless has the power to legislate. Consequently, to count versus other European institutions, it is obliged to act by consensus rather than confrontation, as in a normal national democracy. There are also areas that are solely decided by the European Council of Heads of Government. For instance, direct taxation, social policy, education, health, defence, foreign affairs, where the Commission has a purely consultative role. The Council of Ministers keeps various sovereign areas of competence for themselves as well, where the European Parliament has a purely consultative role. For instance, the Eurogroup looking after the euro. To conclude, member states still maintain control of the functioning of the EU, are at the origin of most proposals and decisions, but don't take responsibility for them unless they are popular. The remainder being blamed on Brussels, the Commission. I would like to take the opportunity here to show you a slide that I consider key to stress the importance of the EU. It seems to me that the huge growth of the world's population since a century, and especially over the last 50 years, has not been taken into account by the Western world. In 1900, when Europe governed much of the world, 1 in 5 of the world's population was a European. In 1960, the 28 EU states represented 1 in 7 of the world's population. Today, the EU represents 1 in 14 of the world's population, and in 2050, tomorrow, the 28 EU states will represent 1 in 20, the biggest growth to occur in Africa. I don't see how we can hope to keep our European civilization, with its values of democracy, respect of the rule of law and tolerance, to maintain our European sovereignty vis-à-vis China, Russia and the US without being united. It is for this reason that I believe that the English saying, "United we stand, divided we fall," is very relevant here. We have now finished part 1, and here in part 2 we will be looking at the major European institutions. Let's start with the European Council. To recap, the second circle of our graph here. These are the main workings of the European Council. For instance, it takes the big decisions, new treaties, new members.
But as I've already said, there are many areas where they retain the power of decision for reasons of national sovereignty, but also for the management of crises. For instance, the financial crisis of 2007. To continue here, various comments about the nomination and the workings of the European Council. Note that its president represents the EU for security and foreign policy matters, the face of a political Europe. Further details about the European Council. Note about its role. The European Council provides the EU with the necessary impetus for its development and shall define the general political direction and priorities thereof. This is the Treaty of Lisbon. Let's have a look at the European Commission in the centre of our graph here.
Here are details about the European Commission. It has, in theory, the monopoly of initiating proposals, but as we've seen, proposals come from many other sources. It is the guardian of the treaties, a key role, where it ensures that member states adhere to the rules and regulations as set out in the treaties. It represents the EU in the world. Regarding its composition, there is one commissioner per member state, but per the Lisbon Treaty there were due to be fewer, but because of a referendum in Ireland it was insisted upon that there should be one commissioner per member state. Regarding its administration, there are 33,000 civil servants spread between Brussels and Luxembourg, and for all European institutions there are 56,000. Please note the evolutions in the nomination of the President of the Commission, which until 2014 was decided by the European Council and only in 2014 according to the sole wishes of the European Parliament. Member States have often nominated weak presidents to buttress their power versus the Commission. Please also note that the European Parliament auditions and agrees or not on the appointment of commissioners, which is a significant democratic advance on many other governmental systems.
Let's have a look at the Council of Ministers, the voice of member countries. At the bottom left of our graph.
Here are details of the Council of Ministers, where we can see its role, its members, its seat, and the groupings. As we've seen, it has a key role in deciding on European legislation together with the Parliament in most cases. It finalises international agreements together with Parliament. I'd like to draw your attention to the 10 groupings below, where they work on the detailed proposals and regulations together with the other institutions, and where every 6 months a different member state assumes the presidency of the Council and of these individual groupings.
Here we look at how the Council of Ministers votes. A major advance of the Treaty of Lisbon in 2009 was to extend the number of areas where member states could decide by majority vote and not unanimously. Unfortunately, there are still several areas still requiring unanimity, for instance, tax havens. A qualified majority requires the agreement of 55% of member states, representing 65% of the EU's population. But for certain subjects with key sovereignty issues, again, unanimity is required. But a major evolution of the EU treaties is that member states can decide to form an advance guard to proceed further in an area, but subject to certain rules. For instance, the Schengen Agreement regarding free movement within EU countries started in 1985 with only 5 countries and now concerns 26 countries. Let's have a look at the European Parliament, the voice of its citizens. on the bottom right of our graph.
Here are details about the European Parliament, whose powers were considerably increased following the Treaty of Lisbon. We can see here that it has the legislative power that we've already discussed. It exercises control over the European institutions. It votes the European budget together with the Council of Ministers. And in May 2019, it had 751 European deputies, but this is going to be reduced to 705 following Brexit. Here are details about the European Parliament that was voted in May 2019 with its 751 members. The major parties are, on the right, the European People's Party, on the left, the Socialists and Democrats, and in the centre, Renew Europe. The Parliament was voted in by proportional representation with a minimum threshold of 3% according to member state. To form a party, you need at least 25 deputies from a minimum 8 member states. Please note that following Brexit, the number of members will fall to 705.
Here are a couple of reliable websites if you want to investigate further yourself how the European Union functions. I found Europe Direct very useful because here you can ring people in Brussels who then will answer your question, or you can send an email, and I found it particularly useful because they always reply back, and I've been very satisfied with their service.